"Stop, please don't do this," I shouted. But my voice disappeared beneath Karen's furious screams. The paramedic never even looked up. He stayed focused on my cousin, doing everything he could to keep him breathing while chaos swallowed the driveway. Then I saw it. A metal bat clutched in Karen's hands, raised with terrifying determination. For one impossible second, I convinced myself she was only trying to scare everyone. I couldn't have been more wrong. She kept yelling that she had warned us, that nobody should have dared help him, as though saving a life somehow violated her precious rules. Neighbors poured onto their lawns, frozen in disbelief, phones lifted, mouths hanging open, unable to understand what they were witnessing. Even now, replaying that afternoon in my mind, I still struggle to believe it happened in broad daylight, with an entire neighborhood watching. We all thought Karen had finally reached her limit. We were wrong, but none of us knew she was only seconds away from destroying her own life. Here's how it all started. My name is Daniel, and until that week, I believed our neighborhood was one of the quietest places anyone could live. The streets were clean, the lawns were trimmed, and most people kept to themselves. It wasn't perfect, but it felt peaceful enough that I never imagined an ordinary family visit would become the beginning of a nightmare everyone on our block would remember. My cousin Toby had flown in for a few days to unwind after months of non-stop work. He was the kind of person who made every room lighter, always smiling, cracking harmless jokes, and offering to help before anyone could even ask. Within hours, he'd already washed dishes, carried groceries inside, and introduced himself to neighbors with genuine kindness. The only person who didn't seem interested in returning that kindness was Karen. I noticed her watching from the front window of her house the morning after Toby arrived. When we walked outside, her curtains shifted just enough for me to catch her staring. Later, she wandered past our driveway carrying a clipboard, pretending to inspect landscaping that wasn't even near her property. She smiled as she approached, but it felt rehearsed rather than friendly. She asked where Toby lived, how long he planned to stay, and whether he'd registered as a guest with the homeowners association. I answered politely because none of the questions seemed worth arguing over. She scribbled notes after every answer, thanked me with a tight smile, and slowly walked away. Over the next 2 days, I caught her driving past the house more often, pausing whenever Toby sat outside with a cup of coffee. I convinced myself she was simply one of those overly dedicated HOA volunteers who took every rule too seriously. Then, just before she left one afternoon, Karen glanced at Toby, looked back at me, and quietly said, "People like him don't really belong here." After that comment, the atmosphere around my house changed almost overnight. The first complaint appeared in my mailbox 2 days later, claiming my guest's car had been parked too close to the curb, even though it sat exactly where every visitor parked. I shrugged it off, assuming someone had made a mistake. Then another notice arrived, warning that guests could only use designated spaces after receiving prior approval. Funny enough, none of my neighbors had ever mentioned needing approval before. The restrictions kept growing. Toby walked to the community pool one warm afternoon, only to be told his guest pass had suddenly become invalid. The employee looked embarrassed as he explained that the HOA had updated its policies that very morning. The next day, we tried using the neighborhood gym together, but the receptionist hesitated before quietly saying she had been instructed to verify every guest personally. Karen just happened to be standing across the lobby, clipboard tucked under one arm, wearing that same tight smile as if she'd been waiting for the moment. Before I continue, I'm curious about something. Have you ever lived under an HOA or dealt with someone who seemed obsessed with controlling everyone else? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced anything like this, because what happened next still feels unbelievable to me. By the end of the week, official HOA letters were arriving so often they barely fit inside my mailbox. One accused Toby of overusing community facilities. Another questioned the length of his visit. None of them cited an actual rule violation. They simply hinted that someone was monitoring us closely. Neighbors who used to wave every morning suddenly looked away, while others whispered as we walked past, as though Karen had already convinced them we were causing problems. I finally confronted her outside the mailbox station and asked why my family had become such a target. She folded her arms, tapped her clipboard with a pen, and calmly insisted she was just following the rules. The words sounded practiced, almost rehearsed, but her eyes told a different story. This wasn't about policies anymore. It was about making us feel unwelcome. As she turned to leave, she paused just long enough to glance over her shoulder and said, "If you keep pushing back, things can get much worse." For the first time since Toby arrived, the neighborhood felt quiet again. Karen hadn't come by that morning, no letters appeared in the mailbox, and I caught myself thinking, maybe her warning had been nothing more than another attempt to intimidate us. Toby laughed when I mentioned it, telling me not to let one miserable person ruin an otherwise good visit. He headed upstairs to take a shower while I stayed in the kitchen, making coffee, grateful that the tension finally seemed to be fading. Then a violent crash shattered the silence. The sound was so loud it rattled the windows. My heart dropped before my mind could even process what I'd heard. I sprinted toward the bathroom, calling Toby's name over and over. When I pushed the door open, water was spreading across the floor, and Toby was lying awkwardly against the bathtub, one arm trapped beneath him. His face had gone pale, and every breath looked painful. I dropped to my knees beside him, asking if he could move. He tried to smile through the pain, but it quickly turned into a grimace. "Guess I picked the worst vacation to become a stuntman," he joked weakly, trying to keep me calm more than himself. I forced a smile, even though my hands were already shaking as I reached for my phone and called emergency services. The paramedics arrived within minutes, bringing a sense of order into the panic. They moved with calm confidence, checking Toby's pulse, asking him questions, stabilizing his neck, and carefully examining his injuries. One reassured me that they were taking every precaution until they could determine whether he had suffered a serious fracture. Watching professionals take control allowed me to breathe for the first time since the accident. That relief lasted only seconds. A sharp voice echoed from the front doorway before I even saw who it belonged to. Karen marched inside without waiting for permission, her clipboard still tucked beneath one arm. She demanded to know why emergency personnel were treating someone who wasn't a resident of the community. One of the paramedics calmly explained that medical emergencies had nothing to do with HOA policies, and continued caring for Toby without hesitation. Karen's jaw tightened, her face flushed with anger, and I could see something dangerous beginning to build behind her eyes. The lead paramedic didn't even raise his voice. He simply told Karen to step aside because every second mattered. She argued louder, insisting Toby had no right to receive treatment inside the community because he wasn't a homeowner. I stood between them, begging her to stop, but it was like talking to someone who had stopped hearing anything except the sound of her own anger. When neither the paramedics nor I gave in, she glared at all of us with a look that made the room suddenly feel colder. Without another word, she spun around and stormed out the front door. For a few precious seconds, everyone relaxed. I honestly believed she'd finally accepted that she couldn't control the situation. The paramedics lifted Toby carefully onto the stretcher while checking his breathing and keeping him calm. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering to one another after hearing the commotion. Some watched from their driveways, while others stepped closer, hoping everything would be all right. Then someone gasped. I looked toward the street and saw Karen marching back across the lawn. This time she wasn't carrying her clipboard. Both hands gripped a metal baseball bat. She moved with terrifying purpose, her eyes fixed on the paramedics as though they were the ones breaking the rules instead of saving a man's life. For one frozen heartbeat, nobody moved. My mind refused to believe what I was seeing. Sunshine shouted, "Karen, stop!" Another neighbor screamed for everyone to get back. The paramedics remained focused on Toby, unaware of how quickly the danger was closing in. I tried to warn them, but the words caught in my throat. Before anyone could reach her, Karen swung the bat with all her strength. The sickening impact echoed through the driveway as it struck one of the paramedics, sending him crashing to the ground. Everything exploded into chaos. The second paramedic immediately grabbed his radio, urgently requesting police backup while refusing to leave Toby's side. Neighbors rushed forward, some trying to help, others pulling out their phones to record what had just happened. Karen stood over the scene, breathing heavily and screaming that she was protecting the neighborhood, that she had warned everyone this would happen if people ignored HOA rules. Her words sounded completely detached from reality. I knelt beside the injured paramedic, terrified by how still he was, while the growing chorus of distant sirens cut through the panic, racing closer with every passing second. Writing variant equals standard, ID equals 71209. The police arrived almost immediately, flooding the street with flashing lights and sharp commands. Officers rushed toward the driveway, separated everyone from Karen, and secured the scene while paramedics from a second ambulance took over treatment. Karen kept shouting that she had done nothing wrong. She blamed HOA rules, blamed me for bringing Toby into the neighborhood, blamed the paramedics for ignoring her authority, and even blamed the neighbors for encouraging lawlessness. The more she talked, the worse it sounded. But the facts were already impossible to hide. Body camera footage captured the entire confrontation. Multiple neighbors had recorded the attack from different angles. Witness after witness gave statements describing how Karen left, returned with the bat, and struck a paramedic who was trying to save a patient. She was arrested on the spot, handcuffed beside the very driveway where she had spent weeks trying to control everyone else. The fallout came quickly. The HOA removed her from every position she held and publicly announced that she no longer represented the community. Prosecutors charged her with aggravated assault, with a deadly weapon and obstruction of emergency medical services. Months later, the judge sentenced her to prison and ordered her to pay substantial restitution for medical bills, lost wages, and emotional damages. When the case finally ended, nobody celebrated. There were no cheers, no victory speeches, no neighborhood parties. The streets simply felt quiet again. For the first time in weeks, people walked outside without looking over their shoulders, and that silence felt less like emptiness and more like relief. Looking back, I still can't understand how someone could value control more than another person's life. Thankfully, Toby made a full recovery, and I'll always be grateful to the first responders who refused to abandon him, despite everything. Their courage reminded me that compassion always matters more than power. Now I'd like to hear from you. What would you have done in my situation? Do you think Karen received the punishment she deserved? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoy these HOA stories, please like, subscribe, and join our community for more unforgettable stories every single week. Thanks again.